Sir Alex Ferguson, widely considered the greatest manager of all time, with the Scot boasting 13 Premier League titles, 5 FA Cups and 2 Champions Leagues. But was he really that great? Welcome to Fraud Watch, where in today's episode we'll be going over some astonishing facts in order to answer the question, was Sir Alex Ferguson a fraud? So we'll start off with Fergie's humble beginnings in Scotland with Aberdeen. Well, he did manage East Stirlingshire and St Mirren before that, but it was with Aberdeen where he seemed to really burst onto the scene. With Aberdeen, Ferguson won a European Cup Winners' Cup, not a European Cup which is sometimes misconstrued, and he did this in 1983, beating Real Madrid and Bayern Munich on their way to the triumph. Impressive at first considering the standard of Scottish football, or was it? Remember, Scottish football was much more reputable back in the day. Players like Kenny Dalglish, Gordon Strachan and Billy McNeill all plied their trade in the top tier of Scottish football. Celtic were also the first British team to win a European Cup just 16 years prior, and teams like Dundee United were reaching European Cup semi-finals, which is arguably a much tougher feat than what Ferguson achieved. That's not to discredit what Fergie did with Aberdeen whatsoever, it just seems to be totally blown out of proportion. Then again, he won a total of 9 domestic honours in Scotland over 10 years, so it was obvious at that point that he had some sort of managerial capability. With that in mind, Manchester United took a massive risk and Ferguson arrived at Old Trafford in 1986, taking the helm at a sleeping giant. A task no doubt filled with pressure, but when you're someone who dominated in Scotland and even brought Aberdeen European glory, it shouldn't be too arduous a task. Even less so when you've got players like British record signing Brian Robson, Norman Whiteside and Paul McGrath. That being said though, it was not straightforward at all. United finished 11th twice in his first 3 years and even finished 13th in the 4th, just 5 points off relegation. Any United manager in the modern day would have had his home invaded after such performances. Not Fergie, however, he got away with it, which then again is probably a testament to how well the club was ran back then, but anyway. It took United 7 years to win a title under his leadership, winning the 92-93 Premier League title, and from there the floodgates opened as domestic success continued to fly in. It is no debate, however, that any modern day United manager would not have stood a chance of still being in the job after that long. Anyway, just before that title came one of the finest golden generations of all time. David Beckham, the Nevilles, Paul Scholes, Nicky Butt and criminal-turned-footballer Ryan Giggs. The class of 92, a masterstroke of academy practices, and from what we're told this must have been because of Sir Alex, right? Wrong. This was the work of Eric Harrison, a man who was hired as a youth team manager under Fergie's predecessor Ron Atkinson in 1981, but he didn't leave with Atkinson after his sacking. Harrison and Ferguson had a discussion which raised the concern of the lack of young talent coming into the first team, with Norman Whiteside being the only real moneymaker of the past decade. Harrison agreed on improving the club's youth network and subsequently brought in the 6 that were known as Fergie's fledglings. Sure, it was bold of Fergie to give these lads minutes in the first team, but it was Harrison who nurtured them. He helped give them the skills and most importantly instilled determination and character into the crop, which saw them develop into first team regulars under Ferguson. Coincidentally, Sir Alex never really nurtured much young talent after Harrison left in 2008, with just Johnny Evans and maybe Federico Macheda being the only graduates to come to mind. The work of Louis van Gaal completely contrasts and busts the myth that Ferguson is a good youth nurturer. Van Gaal handed debuts to talent such as Jesse Lingard, Marcus Rashford and Andreas Pereira, yet he ultimately paid the price for trusting his youth. Even notorious lone banisher Jose Mourinho did better with the youth in his time, and so did Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Besides the class of 92 as well, another incredibly lucky break for Fergie came in the early 90s. Obviously, in 1992, Rupert Murdoch and Sky sold, or in this case purchased, the soul of football, pumping hundreds of millions into what they called the Premier League. These fortunes are now colloquially known as TV money, and logically the higher you finish, the more share of this you get. With United winning the inaugural Premier League title and then a further 3 in the following 4 years, they would have received a very handsome pay packet from Sky. This TV deal signalled a new dawn in English football, with clubs like United now being able to freely spend on all the world-class talent they could imagine, and so began the era of a free-spending, dominant United side, spending fees that when converted to modern figures are absolutely absurd, and I'll get onto that in a second. Anyway, before that, looking back at Fergie's transfer dealings during his time at United, it would appear as though he was a negotiating genius. However, scratching beneath the surface of Cristiano Ronaldo's, Roy Keane's and Eric Cantona's will have you finding a lot more Eric Jembas, Bebes and Massimo Taibis. Looking through United's entire entire list of signings under Fergie, you'd be surprised to see that about 2/3 of them were undeniably unsuccessful. This made me seriously question both Fergie and the club's scouting know-how, as well as his so-called brilliant development of talent. Ignoring that, some of the prices he paid for these players when adjusted for inflation are utterly ridiculous. The transfer index on totallymoney.com has taken the liberty of adjusting the fees for us, and from there it's quite clear to see why Fergie was so successful with United. Here are some examples for you. Rio Ferdinand, 158 million. Andy Cole, 122 million. 18-year-old Wayne Rooney, 119 million. Supposed massive bargain Roy Keane, 118 million. Notorious flop Juan Sebastian Veron, 86 million. Michael Carrick, 84 million. I hope you get the point here. People use the chequebook manager argument against greats such as Mourinho, Guardiola and even Ancelotti, but they don't really appear to know what inflation is. I feel like the class of 92 seriously deludes people when they consider how much Fergie spent, as there seems to be this incorrect ideology that he spent nothing and turned dirt into diamonds. Yes, the modern day United side shows that you've got to get your spending spot on, but you can't deny that Fergie spent so much money. There was also a bit of a Machiavellian way that United went about their signings during Fergie's time. I mean that in the sense that they would just take the best players in the Premier League from the clubs with little control, much like a lot of the top 6 do now. I mentioned Rooney earlier, who they took off Everton, Robin van Persie from Arsenal, Dwight York from Aston Villa, the list goes on. Fergie was basically a reverse Robin Hood, though you can't really blame him for it because it clearly worked and he was sort of a pioneer for this sort of dealing. The problem I have with this though is that it's just something that so many modern managers are criticised for, like any PSG manager, any Bayern manager or any top 6 Premier League manager. Fergie though, not so much. Anyway, moving on, I mentioned at the start of the video that Fergie's domestic records are absolutely incredible. On a European level however, well, not so much. 2 Champions League trophies in 27 years, only reaching 7 semi-finals. That is hardly a record to be proud of considering the amount of money he spent on his squad, and especially since managers nowadays are written off if they don't win 1 in 5 years. I'm not dismissing his record whatsoever, I just think there's a severe double standard when managers like Sir Alex Ferguson and Pep Guardiola are compared about their records in this competition. The overarching point here is that Fergie didn't create a dynasty or an era of total domination, which is something that Arrigo Sacchi, Zinedine Zidane, Bela Gutmann and Bob Paisley all managed in Europe. Realistically also, I could easily criticise their Champions League win in 1999, but to be honest, I believe those 2 stoppage time goals were a result of the never say die attitude that was instilled at the club thanks to Ferguson, as was the case with their penalty victory against Chelsea in Moscow 14 years ago. Of course, Fergie also reached 2 Champions League finals against prime Barcelona and somewhat understandably lost. However, both Jose Mourinho and Roberto Di Matteo both managed to dismantle Guardiola's side, so it sort of begs the question as to why Sir Alex couldn't. Looking at those finals against Barcelona, it would appear that Fergie was a bit tactically incorrect, with Wayne Rooney even coming out to say a couple years ago that all the players deep down knew it was the wrong approach, that we were abandoning the way that brought us success. Trying to press high and get around Guardiola's Barcelona was suicidal. And this is sort of the next problem. Fergie was not a manager with a set formation or a set game plan. He would switch it up depending on the scenario, which unfortunately for United fans meant a lot of the time that they would tune into boring lethargic football. This was also the reason why plenty of attack-minded midfielders such as Juan Sebastian Veron and even a young Paul Pogba never succeeded under him. He built his squads to include several versatile players such as Darren Fletcher and Ji-Sung Park so he could adapt his game plan in the event of any outcome, as he was more of a strategist than, let's say, a tactical genius. He also appeared to focus more on the motivational side of things, being renowned as a fantastic man manager, which, to be fair, is not up for debate. Getting Roy Keane and Eric Cantona to both perform and stay out of trouble most of the time is nothing short of miraculous, but tactically there was nothing special about the way Ferguson set up his teams. He would adapt to the times and nothing more. Some might say that modern managers can't do that whatsoever, with, for example, Jurgen Klopp being criticised for his one-dimensionality, but there's something very different about Klopp. He has a tried and tested system which he completely revolutionised and perfected over the course of several years, and he brought in a fair bit of success in the process. Fergie could never do anything like that tactically. Adaptivity is impressive, but having no core system isn't. This brings into question the tactical nous of Sir Alex Ferguson. He wasn't an innovator like Helenio Herrera and his Catenaccio approach, like Rinus Michels with Total Football, or like Johan Cruyff with Tiki-Taka. He simply was not a revolutionary manager. Alongside that, analysing his record records against modern day managers, some of whom are revolutionaries, puts a lot into perspective. Against Jose Mourinho, 3 wins from 16. Against Carlo Ancelotti, 6 wins from 14. Against Otmar Hitzfeld, 1 win from 9. Against Louis van Gaal, 1 win from 4. Against Vicente Del Bosque, 1 win from 4. Against Manuel Pellegrini, no wins from 4. Against Pep Guardiola, no wins from 2. I could go on and on. Ferguson was lauded as a manager who adapted to the times, but he didn't appear to have the tactical knowledge to dismantle some managers with certain systems, which absolutely brings his supposed genius into question. So anyway, after weighing up all these facts for a few days now, I've finally come to my conclusion. Was Sir Alex Ferguson, legendary Manchester United manager, a fraud? No, he was not. His domestic success speaks for itself and it will be near impossible to replicate. However, it's my clear understanding that he was hugely overrated by both the press and Manchester United fans. His European record, tactical know-how and several other damning records certainly damaged the credibility of the Scotsman. Alongside that, every manager United employ nowadays always has Fergie's exaggerated achievements looming, so they're practically destined to fail. Take nothing away from him, however, what he did with Man United was incredible, it just wasn't as good as it's made out to be. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. Thank you very much for watching. If you did enjoy, please be sure to like and subscribe. Let me know where you weigh in on the debate, fraud or not a fraud, and I'll see you next time.